Welcome to Psyche Talks. Today we're diving deep into this really fascinating question. What actually shapes, extraordinary success? You shared some really compelling stuff with us, including parts of the audiobook Outliers.
Mm.
And our goal today is basically to unpack these ideas, see what clicks, what surprises us, and, what it all means for how we understand achievement.
Yeah, and the examples are so varied, which is great. We've got Canadian hockey players, uh, tech giants like Bill Gates and Bill Joy, the Beatles in Hamburg, and even these really interesting stories about Jewish immigrants in New York, Genius Studies, Cultural Legacies, KIPP Academy.
Mm,
It's quite a mix.
it really is. Okay, let's start with that hockey thing because it just seems so strange at first glance. Why do so many elite Canadian junior hockey players seem to be born in January, February, or March? It's a big difference, isn't
Oh, it's huge. The stats are pretty stark, actually.
it?
Across different age groups, different levels in Canada, those first few months dominate.
Yeah.
One study found, I think it was in Ontario's junior league, like 5 times more players born in January than in November.
5 times. Wow. Okay, so it's not just like a coincidence. Are January babies just naturally better hockey players? What's the deal?
Well, it comes down to how youth sports leagues are set up, usually with age cutoffs, like January 1st. So a kid born January 1st is playing in the same league as someone born, say, December 31st of the same year. That January kid is almost a full year older. And at that age, that often means bigger, stronger, more coordinated.
Ah, okay. So it's a relative age thing. They get a physical head start just because of the cutoff date.
Exactly. And that early advantage,
Mm.
it tends to stick.
Right. It probably snowballs, doesn't it?
Precisely. That's the Matthew effect people talk about. Success leads to more success. Because they're a bit bigger, maybe score a bit more early on, they get noticed by coaches, get put on the better teams, get more ice time, better coaching.
And the gap just widens over time. It becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, completely. The initially smaller, relatively younger kids might get discouraged or just not get the same developmental opportunities.
It's interesting you mentioned Denmark does things differently. Delaying grouping?
Yeah, some places like Denmark apparently try to mitigate this by delaying formal ability grouping until kids are older, maybe around age 10, when those physical maturity differences aren't quite so pronounced.
That makes sense. It seems like such a simple structural thing, the cutoff date, but with these huge ripple effects.
It really does. And it's
Yeah.
not just hockey. You even see it showing up in things like college admissions in the U.S. Students who are relatively young for their grade level are sometimes underrepresented in four-year colleges. That initial disadvantage can echo for years.
So this really challenges that simple idea we have, doesn't it? That the best and brightest just naturally float to the top.
Mhm.
It sounds like opportunity, maybe even lucky opportunity, plays a massive role that we often overlook.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Talent is obviously part of the equation, but the sources you sent over really hammer home how often extraordinary achievement hinges on these incredible opportunities. Opportunities that often weren't really earned or deserved in the traditional sense.
Yeah.
They just
Right.
happened.
Okay, let's dig into one of those stories then. Bill Joy, the software guy. His early days seem like a perfect storm of talent meeting, well, incredible luck.
A perfect storm is a good way to put it. So Bill Joy gets to the University of Michigan right when they opened this amazing cutting-edge computer center in 1971.
Sure.
And the key thing, it had time sharing.
Time sharing.
Yeah.
Okay, for those of us who maybe didn't live through that era, why was time sharing such a big deal compared to what came before?
Well, before time sharing, computers were usually batch processed. You'd write your program, often on physical punch cards.
Right, I remember seeing pictures of those.
Yeah, you'd submit your stack of cards, wait hours, maybe even a day, get your printout, find an error, fix it, resubmit. It was slow, really slow. Time sharing let multiple users interact with the main computer simultaneously, in real time, through terminals. It was dynamic, immediate. Joy compared it to the difference between playing chess by mail and playing speed chess. Michigan was one of the pioneers.
So he walks into this environment where he can experiment, learn, get instant feedback, like
Learn.
warp speed compared to the old way.
Exactly. And here's where it gets even luckier. The computer center was open 24 hours a day. And apparently there was a bug, a software glitch. If you typed in a certain code related to time, it didn't charge your account properly. So essentially,
He got unlimited computer time on this state-of-the-art system.
pretty much because of a bug. So he could just spend hour after hour after hour programming, learning, experimenting, way beyond what anyone else could afford or was allocated.
That's unbelievable. So the sheer volume of practice he got thanks to timing and a glitch.
It was immense. That intense period at Michigan with that specific technology available 24/7 was foundational for him rewriting Unix, co-founding Sun Microsystems. It's hard to overstate how crucial that particular window of opportunity was.
And it sounds like Bill Gates had a somewhat similar, incredibly fortunate start, didn't he? Access to a computer way earlier than most kids.
Oh, absolutely.
Sure.
Even earlier in some ways. He got access to a time-sharing terminal at Lakeside, his private school, in 1968. He was in 8th grade.
Eighth grade. In 1968, that's
Yeah.
almost unheard of. Most universities didn't have that kind of access then.
Exactly. And how did the school afford it? The Mothers Club. They used proceeds from, like, a rummage sale to pay for the computer terminal time.
A rummage sale funded the early programming education of Bill Gates. That's quite a story.
Isn't it? And like with Joy, it wasn't just that initial access. Opportunity kept finding him, or maybe he kept finding it. When the school's initial money ran out, one of the students' parents worked at a local company, C-Cubed, that needed someone to test their software on weekends. Gates and his friends jumped on it.
So more computer time.
Loads more. Then they linked up with another company, ISI, that had free computer time during off-peak hours. Then they got access to the University of Washington. Then a project for TRW analyzing power grid data.
It just kept rolling, one opportunity after another, letting him rack up thousands of hours of programming experience while still in high school.
Exactly. By the time he dropped out of Harvard, he'd blown past that sort of mythical 10,000-hour mark for practice. Way past it.
And he himself acknowledges this, right? That he was incredibly lucky with the timing and the access.
Yeah, he's been quite open about his incredible good fortune. It wasn't just that he was smart. It was being in the right place at the right time with access that almost nobody else had.
Okay, so we have tech. What about something totally different, like music? The Beatles and their Hamburg experience. That sounds less like lucky access and more like trial by fire.
Definitely more trial by fire, but still a crucial period of intense practice driven by circumstance. Between 1960 and 1962, they went to Hamburg multiple times, playing these long residencies in petty rough strip clubs on the Reeperbahn.
Not exactly glamorous digs.
Not at all. But the key thing was the amount they had to play, night after night, for hours on end, sometimes 8 hours a night.
8 hours.
A night. Yeah. They estimated that by the time they hit it big in 62, 63, they'd performed live something like 1,200 times.
1,200 times. That's staggering. Most bands today don't play that much in their entire career.
Exactly. And playing that much, often to indifferent or rowdy audiences, forced them to get tight, develop stamina, expand their repertoire massively. They had to fill all that time and figure out how to perform, how to hold an audience.
John Lennon talked about this, didn't he? How Hamburg just made them better players, more confident.
He did. He basically said they had to perform for hours and hours, and they just got better and better through sheer repetition and necessity. It forged them. They went from being, by most accounts, a pretty average band to something really unique and polished.
So Hamburg was their version of the 10,000 hours, crammed into a couple of intense years, driven by the need to just keep playing.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
It was their crucible. It highlights again that reaching mastery often involves this massive amount of practice.
Yeah.
But you need the opportunity to do that practice. For them, the opportunity was those grueling Hamburg gigs.
Which brings us back to that 10,000-hour rule idea, that it takes roughly that much dedicated practice to become truly world-class at something complex.
Yeah, it's a concept popularized by Anders Ericsson's research and then featured in Outliers. The idea is that practice isn't just something experts do, it's the thing that makes them experts.
But as we've seen with Joy, Gates, and the Beatles, getting those 10,000 hours isn't usually just about individual grit, is it?
No, rarely. It almost always requires supportive parents or financial means or special programs or just plain luck like finding that computer bug or landing those Hamburg gigs. Think back to the hockey players. Those born later in the year might have the same potential talent, but they miss out on the early opportunities for intensive practice that the relatively older kids get, so they might never reach that 10,000-hour threshold in the same way.
Even Mozart, the ultimate child prodigy.
Even Mozart. His father, Leopold, was a musician and composer who dedicated enormous amounts of time to teaching him from an incredibly young age. He had thousands of hours of practice under his belt before he was even a teenager. The opportunity was crucial.
Okay, so opportunity for practice is key. And we touched on timing with Gates and Joy. Being born at the right moment for a technological revolution. That seems like another huge factor.
It really does. The book points out this striking pattern. If you look at, like, the 75 richest people in history, there's a noticeable cluster of birth years around 1835 to 1845. Why? That put them in their prime during the massive economic transformation of the American Industrial Revolution, railroads, oil, manufacturing.
They were the right age to build those empires.
Exactly. And then you see another spike, maybe even more pronounced, around 1954, 1955.
Which is right when?
The personal computer revolution was about to explode. Gates, born 1955, Paul Allen, 1953, Steve Ballmer, 1956, Steve Jobs, also 1955, though a different path. The Sun Microsystems founders, mostly born around 54 or 55.
Wow. It's like being born in that specific narrow window gave them the perfect timing to ride that massive wave. Old enough to understand it and contribute, young enough to shape it.
Precisely. That sweet spot, as you called it earlier. Too early, and the technology isn't ready. Too late, and the ground floor opportunities are already taken.
And maybe being in the right place geographically helps too, like Jobs growing up in Silicon Valley.
Absolutely. Being surrounded by Hewlett-Packard engineers, the whole culture of innovation there, that undoubtedly shaped him and gave him exposure others wouldn't have had. It all feeds into this idea that success isn't created in a vacuum.
So it seems like we're dismantling the myth of the lone genius, the person who succeeds purely based on their own innate ability, like IQ.
Yeah, the sources really push back against that. IQ is important, sure, but maybe only up to a certain point.
What do you mean up to a point?
Well, there's this idea of a threshold. Like maybe you need an IQ of, say, 120 or 130 to handle complex work like being a physicist or a top lawyer.
Yeah.
But beyond that threshold, having an even higher IQ, 150, 180, even 200, doesn't necessarily translate into significantly greater real-world success.
Interesting. So once you're smart enough, other factors become more important.
Exactly. And the book contrasts Chris Langan, who has an exceptionally high IQ, but had a very difficult upbringing and struggled to navigate the world, with someone like J. Robert Oppenheimer.
Oppenheimer, the physicist who led the Manhattan Project.
Right. Also brilliant, obviously, but came from a privileged background. His upbringing likely instilled what the sociologist Annette Leroux calls concerted cultivation.
Concerted cultivation, what's that?
It's basically a parenting style, often found in middle and upper-class families, that actively fosters a child's talents and skills. They're taught how to interact with authority figures, how to negotiate, how to advocate for themselves, how to feel entitled to shape their environment.
Okay, so it's about learning practical social skills, how to navigate institutions.
Precisely. It's practical intelligence, knowing what to say, who to say it to, when to say it. Langan, despite his genius, lacked that. His difficult background taught him distrust of authority, a sense of constraint. He struggled with things like filling out financial aid forms or talking his way into schedule changes, things Oppenheimer likely navigated with ease.
So high IQ isn't enough. You also need this practical intelligence, this savviness, which is often learned through upbringing and background.
It seems to be a huge factor. There was this famous long-term study by Louis Terman following gifted children called termites. Decades later, they found that while all were highly intelligent, the ones who came from lower socioeconomic backgrounds generally achieved less career success than those from wealthier backgrounds, despite similar IQs. The family background, the practical intelligence, made a difference.
That leads into another fascinating area your sources covered: how apparent disadvantages can sometimes turn into advantages because of timing or circumstance. The story of Joe Flom and the Jewish lawyers in New York.
Yeah, that's a great example. Joe Flom came from a poor Jewish immigrant family, grew up during the Depression. On the surface, lots of disadvantages back then.
Right, facing prejudice, economic hardship.
Exactly. He was brilliant, got into Harvard Law, but when he graduated, the top white shoe law firms in New York basically wouldn't hire someone like him. They were very waspy, very establishment.
So discrimination blocked his path to the traditional top firms.
It did. So he and others like him ended up starting their own firms or joining smaller, less prestigious Jewish firms. And because the establishment firms looked down on certain kinds of work, these newer firms ended up taking it on.
What kind of work?
Things like litigation, especially proxy fights, hostile takeovers. The big, respectable firms considered that kind of work, well, unseemly, below them.
So the dirty work fell to Flom and his peers.
Right. But then, starting in the 1970s, hostile takeovers exploded.
Well,
Suddenly, that unglamorous work became incredibly complex, incredibly lucrative, and absolutely central to corporate finance, and who had spent decades building up expertise in exactly that area.
Flom and the other firms that had been shut out earlier, their disadvantage became a massive advantage when the market shifted.
Precisely. They were perfectly positioned because they'd been forced to specialize in something no one else wanted to do until everyone wanted it done.
That's incredible. And there was another factor too, wasn't there? Something about being born in the 1930s?
Yes, the demographic troughs. Because of the Depression and then World War II, birth rates were really low in the 1930s. So Flom's generation was relatively small. That meant less competition for spots in good schools, smaller class sizes, maybe more attention from teachers, and potentially more opportunities when they enter the workforce compared to the huge baby boom generation that followed. Another sort of accidental advantage.
Wow. So discrimination pushed them into a niche that became valuable, and being part of a small generation gave them a leg up. It's like a convergence of unexpected factors.
Absolutely. And this ties into the broader story of Jewish immigrants in New York, particularly in the garment industry.
Right. The sources talked about how their specific background gave them an edge there.
Yeah, many Jewish immigrants arriving from Eastern Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries weren't peasant farmers like many other immigrant groups. They often came from towns and cities, possessing urban skills, experience with trade, maybe some literacy, and crucially, often experience in the clothing, trade tailoring, dressmaking, things like that.
Skills that were directly applicable to the dominant industry in New York City at the time.
Exactly. The garment industry was the economic engine of New York back then. It needed precisely the skills these immigrants brought. And it was an industry with a relatively low barrier to entry. You could start small, be entrepreneurial.
So their cultural background, the skills they brought from the old world, lined up perfectly with the economic opportunities of their new home.
Perfectly. It wasn't just hard work, although they certainly worked hard. It was meaningful work, work that was complex, autonomous, and had a clear connection between effort and reward, very different from, say, subsistence farming.
And this experience, this type of work, created a cultural legacy that benefited their children.
That's the argument. The skills, the entrepreneurial mindset, the value placed on intellectual work learned in the garment trade, that cultural inheritance helped propel the next generation, people like Joe Flom, into professions like law and medicine. They inherited not money necessarily, but a valuable set of cultural advantages.
It's a compelling idea that culture itself, the legacy of the kind of work your ancestors did, can shape success generations later.
It is. And it leads to another really interesting, maybe even provocative idea in the sources: the connection between rice paddies and math skills.
Rice paddies and math. Okay, you have to explain that one.
So the argument starts by looking at the nature of wet rice agriculture, common in southern China and other parts of Asia. Compared to, say, growing wheat or corn, growing rice in paddies is incredibly labor-intensive and complex.
How so?
It requires careful planning, coordination, meticulous water management, transplanting seedlings, constant weeding. It's a year-round demanding process. Estimates suggest traditional rice farming could take something like 3,000 hours of work per peasant family per year.
3,000 hours, that's a huge amount of work.
It is way more than typical Western peasant farming back then. And crucially, in rice farming, there's a very clear link between effort and reward. The harder you work, the more meticulous you are, the better your yield. It's not as subject to random weather fluctuations or seigneurial whims as some other forms of agriculture.
So it fosters a culture that values persistence, precision, and hard work because those things directly pay off.
That's the theory. It's complex work that requires autonomy and smarts, too. You're managing a small, intricate business, essentially. The sources contrast proverbs from, say, feudal Russia, which tend to be fatalistic, if God wills you will live, with Chinese proverbs emphasizing diligence. No one who can rise before dawn 360 days a year fails to make his family rich.
A different cultural orientation towards effort and outcome.
Exactly, a cultural legacy valuing hard work, persistence, and meticulousness born from the demands of the rice paddy.
Okay, but how does that connect to math?
Well, think about what it takes to succeed in mathematics, especially at higher levels. It's not just about being smart. It requires concentration, willingness to struggle through complex problems, meticulousness, and persistence. You can't just give up when it gets hard.
Right, you have to stick with it.
The argument is that the cultural mindset fostered by centuries of rice farming, that willingness to work long, hard hours and persist through difficulty provides a significant advantage when it comes to learning mathematics.
So the same cultural muscles used for farming rice are beneficial for tackling tough math problems.
That's the idea. The source mentions a researcher, Erling Boe, who suggests that differences in math scores between countries might have less to do with teaching methods and more to do with the underlying cultural attitude towards effort and persistence.
And countries with a strong rice farming history tend to score highly in international math comparisons.
Yes. Think Singapore, South Korea, China, Hong Kong, Japan. They consistently top those rankings. The argument isn't deterministic, of course, but suggests this cultural legacy might be a contributing factor.
It's a fascinating connection. It also makes me think about the Kikki Academy example. That seems less about inherited culture and more about instilling a culture of intense effort.
Absolutely. Key PP schools, like the one described in the South Bronx, are known for their incredibly demanding schedules. Much longer school days, mandatory weekend sessions, shorter summer breaks.
Why the longer hours? What's the philosophy there?
The basic idea is that many students, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds, need more time on task to catch up and excel. More time for instruction, more time for practice, more time to really absorb the material.
So it's about creating an environment of intensive learning, similar in intensity perhaps to Build Joy at the Computer Center or the Beatles in Hamburg.
Exactly. It's about providing the opportunity for that extended, focused effort. The schedule described for one key PP student, Marita, sounds grueling up before 6 a.m., school until 5 p.m., homework for hours after that. It's like the schedule of a law associate or a medical resident.
It sounds incredibly demanding. There must be trade-offs, right? What about just being a kid?
That's the critique, certainly. Students sacrifice playtime, maybe aspects of a traditional childhood, potentially even ties to their old neighborhood culture, if it doesn't prioritize academics in the same intense way.
Right, the book mentioned Marita saying something like, all my friends now are from Camp AP, there's a cost.
There often is. The idea presented is that sometimes achieving success in a particular domain requires shedding parts of your existing legacy or culture and adopting the habits and values demanded by that new path. CAMPP essentially tries to replace the surrounding cultural legacy with its own intensive academic one.
So whether it's inherited cultural legacies like the rice paddy effect or deliberately created environments like Kimmy PP, the message seems to be that the context, the culture, the sheer amount of focused effort matters immensely.
It does. It all points away from the simple innate talent explanation and towards a much more complex picture involving history, community, opportunity, cultural inheritance, and yes, lots and lots of hard work when the chance arises.
It really changes how you think about outliers, doesn't it? They're not just exceptional individuals, they're often products of exceptional circumstances and legacies.
Exactly. It encourages a certain humility, I think, recognizing the role of luck, timing, and the advantages, earned or unearned, that contribute to success. It's less about lone heroes and more about understanding the intricate web that supports achievement.
Success is grounded in this network of advantages, inheritances, maybe lucky breaks.
Both deserved and undeserved,
Right.
earned and just plain fortunate. It's a much richer, more complicated, and maybe more realistic view of how people rise to the top.
So wrapping this up, what does this deep dive mean for you, the listener? It really suggests that pathway to achievement. It's rarely a solo journey just based on raw talent.
Yeah, keep an eye out for those hidden advantages, the lucky breaks, the specific circumstances in your own life, and when you look at others who succeeded. Think about the power of that dedicated practice, but also the opportunities needed for it.
Consider the influence of timing, your environment, those cultural legacies we talked about, maybe from your family, maybe from your field.
And ask yourself, where are the modern-day Hamburgs or lakesides? Where are those places or situations that offer intense immersion and unique growth opportunities? How can understanding cultural strengths, yours or others, be leveraged?
And what can we take away from the sheer dedication seen in places like KPP? That willingness to put in extraordinary effort when given the chance.
These are just some starting points, really, sparked by these fascinating stories. It encourages you to keep exploring these ideas, see how they fit your own experiences and what you observe out there.
It's definitely a more complex but maybe more hopeful picture too, isn't it? If opportunity and circumstance play such a big role, maybe we can think more about how to create those opportunities more widely.
That's a powerful thought to end on. Thinking about those historical gifts and how much more potential could be unlocked if those webs of advantage were cast a bit wider.
Thank you for your support and for listening.